The Electoral Commission of South Africa has released a report of donations received by political parties. The DA and ANC received a combined 43 million rand in donations declared to the IEC between April and June 2023. According to the Commission, this was the second highest declared funding since the law was promulgated in 2021. Well, let's unpack this conversation with the governance expert, Dr. Sam Khoma. Dr. Khoma, I appreciate your time this evening. I'd like to start at the top, and that's with an explanation of the key provisions of the Political Party Funding Act and how it regulates private funding for political parties within the confines of South Africa.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. Yes, so this report, which was released and also is published by the Electoral Commission, that is the IEC, flows from the party funding legislation. You remember some years ago, civil society groups, ordinary members of the public have been calling for transparency around political funding. So we now have the report for the first quarter of 2023, and it is an interesting report to examine because it shows that we have two political parties that are not represented in parliament, yet these parties were able to generate generous funding from their donors, that is the Action SA, led by Herman Mashaba, and also Build One South Africa, that is led by Musi Maimane. Then, of course, we have the Democratic Alliance and also the African National Congress, that is the ANC, also able to attract substantial donations from private capital. So this is done in the spirit of transparency, but very important, the issue of accountability, because we know the identities of these donors, and also we know these amounts that have been dispersed to these political parties. We know the threshold is 100,000 or more that needs to be disclosed by these political parties. So this is what we see highlighted in this first quarter report released by the IEC.
Well, it talks about the disclosure requirements for political parties in terms of reporting donations. And how does the Act actually define donations?
Oh, yeah, so donations is money that is given to the political party from any source. It could be a private company and also other routiers, but it excludes and prohibits donations that are generated from sources like employees working for the state, or a state-owned company, or a state-owned enterprise, or a municipality, or any other organ of state. So political parties cannot receive donations flowing from these sources, but any other source outside the terrain of the state, political parties are entitled to receive such donations.
Now, we understand that the ANC and DA declared a combined 43 million rand in donations between April and June. Right? Now, if we juxtapose these amounts with what the ANC and DA would have received prior to the promulgation of the law, is there a shift? Are you able to tell?
No, this is why I said earlier, civil society, you remember at some point they went to court to force these political parties to disclose where are they getting this money, because then there was a sense that these two political parties, the ANC and the DA, seems to be receiving quite substantial amounts of money from donors and other players, but this funding is not properly regulated in terms of disclosure. And that is the reason then we have this legislation. Out of calls made by civil society groups, ordinary members of the public. Remember, there were political parties which were not happy with the promulgation of this piece of legislation. So it's not a legislation initiated by these political parties, but I'm saying this derives from the work done by civil society groups on the ground to say it's high time we have full disclosure of party funding from the different political parties in the country.
My actual question, Dr. Khoma, is these two parties have received 43 million rand combined. Now, prior to the promulgation of the law, would they have received a similar amount, or would they have received more?
No,
has the new law curtailed donations and financial support of political parties?
Yes, remember, there are political parties that are calling for the review of the legislation to say the threshold of 100K or 100,000 is a bit low. Increase the threshold because they argue that there are donors who want to contribute quite substantial amounts beyond what is put in the legislation. So it tells you, especially if you look at the DA and the ANC. Remember, in the last 2019 national elections, at some point, members and leaders of the ANC disclosed that they spent close to R1 billion to run the election campaign of the party. So it tells you the enormity of the funding that these two parties receive from donors. And if you look at one of the donors for the ANC, the Chancellor House, we know that it's one of the investment wing of the ANC that has been getting lucrative contracts from state-owned companies and other entities.
Now, a little while ago, in fact, in your opening, you talked about Build One South Africa and Herman Mashaba's party as well, when you indicated that those two parties do not have a presence in Parliament, but have received donations. What do you think is the significance of this?
Yes, it means they seem to have rapport with these private capital players. And you remember both the leaders, that is Herman Mashaba and Musi Maimane, they come from the DA before they set up their parties. And you can see one of the donors has donated to Action SA and Build One South Africa and also the DA. So they seem to enjoy some support from donors who are willing to support the initiatives undertaken by the two parties. But I'm saying it's an interesting observation because one would expect that in addition to the ANC and the DA receiving these donations, you'll then also see, say, UDM, okay, for example, or PAC, because they are in Parliament already. So one will expect that this kind of parties, the IFP, for example, will also register some handsome donations from private capital.
Now, when we look obviously at parties like Action SA, for instance, and Musi Maimane's Build One South Africa, do you get the sense that they are obviously these donations are coming from individuals that believe in the organisations, the integrity of those organisations, and that they may soon be in Parliament, or that these donations or support will allow them to make a move in that sort of direction?
Yes. Remember, this funding generally it is meant to ensure that these political parties sustain their organizational operations. In addition to the funding they get from the Electoral Commission, the IEC also has a fund called the Multi-Party Fund. It's open to any donor, but that fund is meant to ensure that there is equitable distribution across the different parties. But it's interesting, if you look at the report, there is a rich amount that is being channeled into the multi-party fund. Instead, donors prefer to directly provide funding to the political parties of their preference, of their liking, and all of that.
Now, Dr. Khoma, I'd just like to focus a little bit on the Electoral Commission of South Africa, the IEC, and how they oversee and monitor political funding declarations, and what steps are taken to ensure compliance with the Political Party Funding Act.
Yes, they've put the system in place. The disclosures are done electronically, which is a good thing, and also the legislation mandates the Electoral Commission to ensure that there is quarterly monitoring and also yearly monitoring of these disclosures done by the political parties. But very important, they are obligated to disclose these reports to members of the public, and that's the reason anyone can go into the Electoral Commission's website to have a glimpse of what is contained in the report. And also, they also report to Parliament on these disclosures.
So are you convinced that the disclosure mechanism ensures that any funds or any support above the threshold of 100,000 rand received by any political party is actually recorded and that information given to the IEC?
Yes, I did. Well, it's unfortunate because the IEC relies on what these parties report to them. You remember, it doesn't mean that none of these political parties, at the moment, they are not getting any funding. They are, but it could be small amounts, 50,000, 60,000 here and there, and all of that. And also there could be other means that some of these parties are able to leverage on as part of soliciting funding from any of the donors. But that is not yet known until such time IEC perfects the system that it has put in place as part of regulating these disclosures.
Now, Dr. Goma, you talk about the IEC perfecting the system. Do you feel that it might have any loopholes currently that could be exploited by any of these political parties?
Yes, this is not a perfect system. There are already loopholes in the legislation. For example, you have a party like the EFF that has already put it on record to say we're not going to disclose anything to the IEC because the guys who are donating to us, they're giving us small amounts which are not meeting the threshold. But in reality, we know that they may be getting substantial donations from different players.
Any other loopholes do you think that exist currently in this party funding?
Yes, you remember, it's a relatively new legislation. We can't safely say IEC has perfected this, and also we can't safely say this is a perfect legislation that is put in place to regulate party funding. And the point I raised earlier, there are calls already to say let's review this piece of legislation by different political parties and other interest groups. So it remains to be seen how, at the end of the day, Parliament will then consider some of these submissions made by interest groups.
Well, Dr. Koma, we're approaching a very interesting period, which is next year's election. And obviously, this promulgation comes at a time was affected when we are on the cusp of an election. What are the implications of the quality of campaigning that we're going to see on the one hand, and do we expect a lot of tinkering to go on behind closed doors within the confines of the political parties to evade exposing some of their funders?
Yes, yeah. So you realize that this is going to be a very competitive national elections, the 2024 one, and that's the reason there is a lot of repositioning. We know that recently 8 political parties went to a national convention to agree on election pact, and they've developed a multi-party charter. We know that there are parties from the left, the PAC and AZAPO in the main, that are also considering election pact, and also in between you have the ANC and also a whole range of other political parties that are already strategizing on how to put together a manifesto that is going to sell to the electorate come the 2024 elections. But for any political party to make it to National Assembly, they have to marshal adequate resources, including financial resources, to be able to pull through a very appealing manifesto that they're able to sell to the broader electorate.
Well, Dr. Koma, very quickly, you pointed out the EFF as an example, and I'd just like to go to the fact that they've suspended or threatened to fire 210 of their councillors who failed to provide buses to their 10th anniversary celebrations. Is this the mechanism that used by the EFF, where they've decentralized fundraising and asked various members of their party to fund different activities, a strategy in part that averts them disclosing those funders?
Yes, you're quite right, Hugo. So this crowdfunding that the EFF said we are using as part of generating our own funds internally to be able to sustain the operations of the political party. They seem to have done very well in the past in terms of generating substantial funds from their own members who are willing to make this contributions to the party. So it's a very interesting and also exciting idea that the EFF has put in place.
Governance expert Dr. Sam Corner, appreciate your time.